Today's episode is a Himachal Pradesh folk tale. It's about a dog who breaks all kinds of traditions by getting a human as its pet. Plus, magical transformations and a crack in a wall of solid gold that just cannot be fixed. Namaskar and welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast that will take you on a journey through the rich mythology, folklore, and history of the Indian subcontinent. I am Narad Muni, the celestial storyteller and the original Time Lord. With my ability to travel through space and time, I can bring you fascinating stories from the past, the present, and the future. From the epic tales of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to the folk tales of the Panchatantra, to stories of Akbar Birbal and Tenali Raman, I have a story for every occasion. The purpose of the stories is neither to pass judgment nor to indoctrinate. My goal is only to share these stories with people who may not have heard them before, and to make them more entertaining for those who have. In this episode, we are doing a folk tale from the northern state of Himachal Pradesh. Let's jump right in. Mr. and Mrs. Kathor were a perfectly ordinary couple. Thank you very much. Mr. Kathor had an ordinary job doing perfectly ordinary things in medieval India. As a general handyman, chopping down trees as a subcontractor to the woodcutter, milking the cows as a subcontractor to the farmer, delivering some messages here and there. Mrs. Kathor was a perfectly ordinary housewife, which was just about the only profession that the patriarchy allowed women. The same patriarchy had engineered the couple into hoping that their unborn child would turn out to be a boy. And that same patriarchy required that they be disappointed when in fact it was a girl. Let's call the child Bholi, which is the Hindi word meaning innocent. This is consistent with our tradition of naming characters after the roles they play. And Bholi was quite innocent in all that was to follow. Along the same lines, Kathor means savior, and you'll soon see why. A curious thing happened on the very day that Bholi was born. A dog came to Mr. and Mrs. Kathor's home. The dog didn't do anything much. He just sat there, observing them all day. Much as Professor McGonagall had done when she had observed Mr. and Mrs. Dursley right before Harry Potter arrived into their lives. Except she'd been a cat. Having been a few centuries too early for the Harry Potter stories, Mr. and Mrs. Kathor did not think too much of the coincidence. Over the next several years, Bholi grew up into a very smart young lady. But Mr. and Mrs. Kathor did not quite appreciate her intelligence, her humor, or her general personality. They only saw in her the chance they had been deprived of, in not having a boy. And so, they treated her much the same way that the Dursleys treated Harry Potter. Every time she got something wrong, they would punish her and threaten her. They kept her on a short leash. Figurative leash, not a literal one. She would often find herself in the doghouse over the smallest of things. Again, a figurative doghouse, not a literal one. Sometimes they would leave her home when going out to eat at the fanciest dhaba, not even bringing back so much as a doggy bag. Even if Bholi tried to provide a very reasonable explanation for any slip ups that her parents accused her of, those explanations fell on deaf ears. To Mr. Kathor at least, it sounded like a dog ate my homework kind of excuse. And the worst threat of all, and the most frequently used, was that they would give her away to the dog. Yes, the very same dog that had visited them on the day she was born. That dog had returned every single day since then. No one bothered to think that this was extremely unusual. Converting Bholi's age into dog years, that meant their daily canine visitor had broken all kinds of longevity records, not even factoring that he had been already fully grown at the time of his first visit. At a minimum, he should have had a long flowing grey beard. But no one thought too deeply about it. Maybe because references like the Guinness Book of World Records or the Limca Book of Records didn't exist yet in that century. You may be wondering what that dog did all day, every day. He was always there. Whether it was one of the dog days of summer or whether it was raining cats and dogs. The dog didn't really do anything. He just lay there and observed everyone. And Mrs. Kathor could actually swear that when the dog saw Bholi, it smiled. One day, the breaking point came when Bholi made a mistake in preparing her parents' afternoon tea. She had put just a wee bit more ginger than how Mr. Kathor liked it. In a fit of rage, he immediately gave her away to the dog. And he meant it. The dog realized that Mr. Kathor meant it and actually yelped with excitement. Mr. Kathor's order almost made the dog raise the woof. Perhaps it was the idea of having a human as a pet. If every dog has his day, today definitely was the day, for this dog at least. As the dog was happily leading Bholi out of her home and towards his own, Mrs. Kathor began having second thoughts. She was the one who had started this whole thing by being the first to threaten this sort of outcome, and now she regretted doing so. But she dared not speak up against her husband's orders. So the best she did was to secretly give her daughter a handful of seeds, to scatter on the way so that they could follow her, if need be. One small bit of consolation was that Mrs. Kathor was confident that the dog would not bite her daughter. She had seen this dog bark once or twice, and she had heard that barking dogs never bite. Bholi meekly followed the dog. Unlike the dog, she was having a rough day. She was not happy to have to leave home, despite the Dursleys-like treatment that she got there. All that time that she had spent at home cooking and cleaning for her parents, it felt like she had just been chasing her own tail. But time to focus on the present. She wondered what kind of home the dog was taking her to. It was unlikely to be a manger, considering all the time over all these years that the dog had spent away from it. But whatever it was, she hoped that it was a place where she could sleep like a log. After all, she had been working like a dog. Never mind this very long walk on top of that. Right now, her throat was parched and she needed water. "I'm thirsty. I need water," she said out loud, and immediately turned crimson in her embarrassment at talking to a dog and expecting it to understand her. Well, this dog not only understood her, but it replied in perfect Hindi. "Of course. There's a well there with water in it. There are steps inside. Let's go down." Bholi was stunned. You can talk? You can actually talk? Why didn't you say anything before? All these years? "No one asked me," the dog replied. "And it wouldn't have been very polite for me to stick my nose into your conversations." They went down the steps until they reached the waterline, and surprisingly, a very shiny golden door. Despite the apparent difficulty, especially for one of canine anatomy, this dog managed to get the key from under the doormat. He managed to unlock the door and easily twist the doorknob and get in. Inside the door was neither a dark cave nor a broom closet for keeping the well clean. What lay beyond these doors was a magical palace and gardens. It was similar to what Dorothy had observed when she first stepped out of her grayscale home and into the colorful land of Oz, to reference yet another Hollywood movie. There was a beautiful garden with plenty of lawn space and a dog walking area. Boli collapsed into the nearest armchair. The furniture was all new and shiny, and on the table were the newest issues of the Vanity Fair and Dog magazines. Crisp new issues with none of the pages dog-eared. The butler bought them some Earl Greyhound tea prior to lunch. And no, he was not a greyhound. He was a regular person. His master, the dog, just liked that flavor of tea. Speaking of the dog, he said he would freshen up and be back. When he returned, Bholi was surprised to discover that he was actually a human too. Yup, he was secretly a prince who had been cursed to transform into a dog whenever he was on the surface. Bholi wondered why he hadn't just stayed down there as a human. But the dog prince shook his head. That would be the wrong option to pursue. You could say she was barking up the wrong tree. Or if she preferred, him staying down here would be like the tail wagging the dog. His primary priority was her. You see, there was a rift in the wall. And there was a prophecy. Bholi rolled her eyes. There always was one. It wasn't fun down here at all. It got boring pretty quick. The dog prince went on to explain that it wasn't fun down here at all. It got boring pretty quick. There weren't enough cats to chase or bones to pick with anyone. It was no fun spending time with a German shepherd who insisted on only minding the sheep, specifically German sheep, or the Dalmatian who insisted on playing hide and seek, though he was easily spotted, or the Great Dane who was scared of the smallest of dangers. Sure, it wasn't the very worst, but it came close. The very worst would have been a dog-eat-dog world. Speaking of which, lunch was now served. Bon appetit, the dog prince wished Bholi before diving into his meal, which thankfully was not just boneless but also meatless. I'm a veggie dog, he said, to explain the lack of carnivorous options at the dinner table. Time went on and healed the dog prince's boredom. Now that he had a perfectly normal companion, he seemed a lot more content with this underground world. Bholi and the dog prince took their acquaintanceship to friendship and eventually to marriage. Everything was going fine. With the treasury of the dog prince's kingdom at her disposal, Bholi felt generous enough to send out a greeting card and a box of sweets to her Dursley like parents. This was on the occasion of one particular Diwali. She was careful to leave out a return address though. If they knew she was rich and happy, or even just happy, they'd show up to spoil her fun. She couldn't have been more correct. And though she had carefully omitted the return address, she had forgotten the handful of seeds that her mother had given her. She had spread them at regular intervals during her journey here. And each of those seeds had now grown into a plant with distinctive flowers, like trail markers. That is how Mr. Kathor reached the well. Seeing a brilliantly shiny door down there, he walked down the steps and rang the bell. There were some pats on the back, some handshakes, and lots of enthusiasm, mainly from Mr. Kathor. It took Bholi a moment or two, but she finally let bygones be bygones and welcomed her father warmly. The dog prince was a lot more genial as a host. He offered the best food and drink for his father-in-law, and he showed him around the palace, the home puppet theatre, with the surround sound, which basically meant there was room for co-puppeteers to stand in every corner of the room and for everyone to deliver their lines in a synchronized way. "This place is perfect," Mr. Kathor said. "It's flawless." "Sasurji, I don't agree with you there," the dog prince said, using the Hindi word for father-in-law. After that, he did not launch into the same rant as he had with Bholi about the Dalmatian, the Great Dane, the German Shepherd, but instead, he complained about possibly the only flaw in the place. And that flaw was a big crack in the wall of the Golden Palace. "I don't get it. This is just solid gold. You can just put some gold foil on this. Why do you really care about the crack?" Mr. Kathor asked. But the dog prince shook his head. He explained that there was a prophecy. This crack in the wall was a freebie that came with his own transformation into a dog. This could only be repaired by the father of a girl who had given away his daughter to the dog prince, provided that father also then visited them exactly a year later. "Fine, get me some gold foil and I can repair it." "Not so fast, Sasurji. That won't work. You need to mind my cattle for 12 years. Mr. Kathor was suspicious. "Are you trying to get free work out of me?" But the dog prince said no. That was definitely not the case. "Makasam," he added. Well, Mr. Kathor did mind the dog prince's cattle for 12 years. And magically, the crack repaired itself. The dog prince insisted that that is why it got fixed. All of this had not been just an elaborate plot to make his father-in-law repent for his earlier mistreatment of his daughter. Mr. Kathor secretly still felt that a simple bit of gold foil could have avoided all this. But he was thankful to go back home after 12 years with rich clothes and gifts for Mrs. Kathor. That's where the story ends. A couple of notes. Strictly speaking, this folk tale isn't only from Himachal Pradesh. There are similar stories in other areas. To some degree, there is even similarity between this story and the Punjabi folk tale of the Crocodile King from episode 203. There's the theme of a girl marrying a royal who had been transformed into an animal, and the theme of the parent visiting the girl in her new home. In the next episode, we'll be hearing the story of how a woman brought the entire world down to its knees. The one who rescued the world from a cold, bleak death was another woman, Anasuya. Anasuya may be well known as the wife of one of the Saptarishis, but she was a very remarkable person in her own right. Thank you all for the comments on social media and on Spotify's Q&A. I can't directly reply to the questions there, but I'll address them here on this show. Samay, thank you for the praise, and I can certainly think of a few more stories that prominently feature parrots. More to come on those. Kyra, thank you for the praise. As for the biggest fan of the podcast, I don't know. It's been different folks at different times. And I count myself amongst that. There's nothing that says that I can't be a fan of my own work. Libby, thank you so much for the kind words. I appreciate your long-term support. Abir, indeed, yes. Thanks to you and many others who have provided valuable suggestions that have improved this podcast. Abhinav, as it happens, the next story refers to another story that involves the Holy Trinity and myself. I'll cover that one soon as well. If you have any other comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or reply to the questions on Spotify's Q&A. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. You can listen to the show on all podcast apps, and that now includes YouTube. If you want to send me an email, it's storiesfromindiapodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.